Hey guys, tonight we step into a city that no longer exists, though at its height it was one of the most complex urban centers in the world. Imagine the chill of evening air drifting down from volcanic mountains, the water of a lake shimmering with the reflection of countless torchlights, and the faint sound of drums echoing across canals. We are in Tenochtitlan, the capital of the Aztec world, where daily life moved with a rhythm as strict as it was grand. You probably won't survive this, not because of some gory spectacle, but because the pace of survival here demanded constant labor, constant ritual, and constant obedience to a system that never let anyone truly rest. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you don't mind, post your location and the local time in the comments. I love seeing where and when you're listening. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The Aztec Empire in the early 16th century was both dazzling and exhausting. The name Aztec is a modern label, but the people themselves referred to their alliance as the Mexica. At its peak, their capital of Tenochtitlan housed well over 200,000 inhabitants, an urban density greater than many European cities of the same period. But let's set aside the spectacular temples for now and focus on what kept the city alive day after day. The Aztec calendar was built around two cycles: the Tonal Pohualli, a ritual 260-day cycle, and the Xiuhpohualli, a solar 365-day cycle. Ordinary people did not live in abstract calendars, though. They lived by the cycles of maize planting, harvesting, and tribute payments. The empire demanded grain, textiles, cacao, feathers, and countless other goods, and those demands were met by households who worked the ell, and until their hands cracked, and women who spent hours at the grinding stone, turning maize into mesa for tortillas. If you were born into an ordinary Aztec family, your life began in a calpulli, a neighborhood unit that functioned as both kinship group and administrative block. Each calpulli had its own fields, its own schools for children, and its own obligations to the empire. It was here that the rhythms of daily existence unfolded. Irrigation canals cleared of weeds, chinampas, those famous floating gardens rebuilt after floods, and the monotony of cooking, weaving, and grinding. The chinampa system was one of the empire's greatest logistical achievements. Imagine narrow strips of land built up with mud and reeds, surrounded by canals. Farmers cultivated maize, beans, squash, chilies, and flowers on these plots, rotating crops to prevent soil exhaustion. The canals themselves served as transport routes, filled with canoes that ferried produce into the markets of Tenochtitlan. Every day, thousands of paddlers navigated these waters, carrying bundles of maize, fish caught with woven nets, and baskets of tomatoes. Life was not defined by military conquest for most people, but by this repetitive, seasonal labor. In the city, mornings began early. Before dawn, women would light the hearth and begin grinding maize on a metate. The process was long and tedious. Kernels had been soaked in lime water overnight to make them more nutritious, and now they had to be crushed into dough. A household might prepare hundreds of tortillas each week, not just for their own meals, but also to pay tribute. The sound of grinding stones was as constant as birdsong, echoing across every calpulli. Breakfast for a commoner was rarely extravagant. A thin maize gruel called atole, sometimes flavored with chili, sometimes with honey if you were lucky. The wealthy might drink cacao frothed into a bitter, energizing beverage. But for most, the day began with something filling and unremarkable. Children were often expected to help in chores from an early age, carrying water from canals, fetching firewood, or tending to younger siblings. By mid-morning, the great marketplace of Tlatelolco, the twin city to Tenochtitlan, began to hum with activity. Spanish observers later marveled at its orderliness, claiming that 20,000 to 40,000 people gathered there on market days. Vendors laid out rows of beans, peppers, obsidian blades, cotton cloth, and live turkeys. Prices were set by barter or with cacao beans, which served as a kind of currency. Market inspectors patrolled to ensure honesty. Cheating a customer was not just bad manners, but a punishable offense. You can imagine yourself there, the smell of roasted chilies mingling with the sharp odor of fish drying in the sun, the constant drone of voices haggling, and the visual overwhelm of bright featherwork, jade beads, and painted pottery. And yet, much of it was mundane. Endless exchanges of tortillas, firewood bundles, and simple clay pots. This was the lifeblood of the city. Beyond markets, tribute collections structured daily life. Every region under Aztec control was required to deliver goods to the capital on a fixed schedule. Tribute lists survive in codices, detailed records showing towns owing hundreds of blankets, baskets of maize, and even live eagles. These were not optional. Failing to meet tribute obligations invited punishment or worse. For the ordinary farmer, this meant that much of the harvest never stayed at home. Even when granaries looked full, the knowledge that much would be hauled away kept stomachs angst. Religion, too, was woven into every moment of the day. Temples towered over neighborhoods, but daily devotion happened at household shrines. Families burned copal incense, offered bits of food, and observed countless taboos linked to the calendar. For example, particular days were considered unlucky for planting, while others were auspicious for weaving. Life was not just physically demanding, but also mentally exhausting as one navigated the unseen rules of ritual time. Children were educated according to social status. Noble boys attended the Kalmakak, where they studied astronomy, history, ritual recitation, and military skills. Commoner boys entered the Telpochkali, a community school emphasizing discipline, agricultural labor, and basic combat training. Girls, meanwhile, were instructed at home in weaving, cooking, and household management, though daughters of nobility could also be trained for roles as priestesses. Schooling was strict. Teachers used Magi thorns to prick the skin of inattentive students. It was not cruelty, but discipline, ensuring that each generation upheld the empire's order. We tend to picture the Aztecs through the lens of their military and religious spectacle, but the truth is that survival depended on boring, repetitive systems. Canals dredged every season, maize planted on precise dates, markets regulated by stern officials, and children drilled in memorization of prayers. Without these, the empire would have collapsed long before the Spanish ever arrived. Even leisure reflected duty. The ball game, played with a heavy rubber ball on stone courts, was both entertainment and ritual. Gambling with cacao beans was common, but games also reinforced social order. Only certain classes could compete formally. Feasts occurred, yes, with music played on flutes and drums, but these too were structured around the calendar of rituals. Rare. Did anyone escape the cycles of tribute, work, and devotion? At night, the city of Tenochtitlan did not fall silent. Torches lit the causeways, and the sound of drums from temples carried across the water. Families gathered to eat tamales or stews, sharing food in households where extended kin often lived together. Sleep came on reed mats, under blankets woven from maguey fibers. Yet even in rest, obligations hovered. Tomorrow, the maize must be weeded again. Tomorrow, the officials might come collecting tribute. Tomorrow, another ceremony would fill the plaza. The Aztec system functioned like a massive machine. Every cog, the farmer, the weaver, the canoe paddler, necessary for the empire to continue. And though we remember its pyramids and warriors, what truly made the empire formidable was this endless rhythm of ordinary life. Still, one question lingers in the silence of the city at night. How long can such an intricate system, dependent on tribute and constant labor, sustain itself before the weight of its own demands begins to crack the foundations? If you stayed through the long rhythm of daily survival in Tenochtitlan, you begin to notice how every person's role was preordained. Birth did not simply mark life. It set expectations. Midwives whispered prophecies at the moment of delivery, declaring whether a child was destined for the fields, the loom, the temple, or the battlefield. These words were not casual. They were seen as threads binding the newborn to the cosmic fabric. A life of maize grinding might seem dull to us, but to the Aztecs, it was no less sacred than offering blood to the gods atop the Templo Mayor. Let us look more closely at what this meant in the daily grind. For men, the expectation of military service was unavoidable. From adolescence, boys at the Telpoch Kali trained to carry shields, throw spears, and march in disciplined units. Training included not only combat practice, but also hard labor, hauling timber, repairing canals, and carrying supplies. War, after all, required logistics before heroism. Aztec armies could not march without food, and so boys learned the patient labor of preparing rations, dried maize, salted fish, and tamales wrapped for transport. Yet war was not constant. For much of the year, men lived as farmers, fishermen, and craftsmen. The call to campaign came in cycles, announced by officials and priests. Families had to adjust instantly, sending sons and husbands away while women took on even more of the burden at home. This rhythm of sudden absence, followed by return, shaped household life with uncertainty. Women's routines were just as structured. Weaving was more than a craft. It was an economic necessity. Each tribute list demanded thousands of cotton garments, and every woman of a Kalpuli contributed to this quota. The backstrap loom required long hours of repetitive motion, producing cloth that became not only clothing, but also a form of currency. Mothers taught daughters to weave as soon as their hands were strong enough to pull thread. The act itself was surrounded by ritual. Looms were considered sacred tools, and neglecting one risked divine displeasure. Religious specialists, the priests, filled another crucial role. Their lives were defined by austerity, fasting, bloodletting, and sleepless nights spent chanting. But beyond the drama of major ceremonies, their daily duties were painstaking. Priests calculated ritual calendars, ensuring that every festival aligned with celestial movements. They maintained temple fires, collected offerings, and recited long lists of invocations. Much of it was tedious, but any mistake risked cosmic imbalance. Imagine copying endless calculations by hand, watching the stars night after night, your eyelids heavy, yet knowing that missing a sign could doom your people. The empire's survival also depended on tribute collection and redistribution. This was the domain of bureaucrats and runners. Tribute lists were recorded in painted codices, and trained couriers, fleet-footed men running relay across causeways and roads, delivered goods and information. Daily, these runners darted through Kalpuli, carrying messages wrapped in cloth. Their endurance was legendary, but the job was more draining than glorious. Hours of running under the sun, carrying baskets of cacao or bundles of quills, was a grind that blurred into routine. The Aztec economy functioned like a web, with Tenochtitlan at its center. Regional towns sent their produce inward, and the capital redistributed goods to armies, temples, and nobles. Grain moved constantly, stored in granaries where officials measured and recorded amounts. Spoilage was a constant threat, requiring careful rotation of supplies. Even firewood had to be rationed, since the valley's forests were under pressure. The city consumed mountains of resources, and managing them was a quiet but monumental task. The agricultural year shaped everything. In spring, fields were prepared, canals dredged, chinampa edges reinforced with willow stakes, and maize seedlings transplanted. Summer brought endless weeding and watering, while autumn required harvest crews working from dawn until dusk. Winter was not a time of rest. Instead, it was the season of repair, weaving, and preparation for the next cycle. The empire's festivals mirrored these rhythms, ceremonies for planting, for rains, for harvest, each aligning human labor with divine expectation. Daily food habits reveal the weight of these cycles. Maize was the foundation, eaten as tortillas, tamales, and gruel. Beans provided protein, chilies added flavor, and squash gave variety. Meat was rare for commoners: turkey, duck, or rabbit, if one was lucky. Fish and insects supplemented diets, especially in lake communities. Preparation was constant. Tortillas had to be made fresh, tamales wrapped and steamed, beans soaked overnight. Nothing was instant. Every meal meant hours of prior labor. Social order enforced discipline. Nobles enjoyed privileges, better houses, cacao drinks, ornate clothing. But they too had obligations, governing Kalpuli, supervising tribute, and leading rituals. Punishments for misbehavior were harsh across classes. Drunkenness was tolerated only among the elderly. Theft was punished by enslavement. Order was not simply desired, it was enforced to maintain the empire's balance. Festivals punctuated this order, offering bursts of communal activity. Every 20 days brought a new ritual, from dances honoring maize deities to processions carrying idols through neighborhoods. But even here, obligation overshadowed celebration. Households were required to provide offerings, clean public spaces, and participate in rehearsed dances. The joy of music and costume existed, but beneath it lay duty at the heart of affairs. The city, the Templo Mayor, rose like a layered mountain. From afar, it dominated the skyline. For ordinary citizens, however, the temple was less a wonder than a constant demand. Sweeping its steps, carrying water for its rituals, delivering offerings, these tasks consumed countless hours of labor. Few ever climbed its summit, but all felt its pull in daily chores. Nightfall brought only temporary relief. Families gathered around hearths, telling stories of gods and heroes, but even leisure reinforced tradition. Elders recited genealogies and moral lessons, warning against laziness or disrespect. Children listened while weaving mats or shelling maize. The household was both shelter and school, discipline extending into every corner. If you step back from these details, what emerges is not a picture of spectacle, but of relentless order. The Aztec Empire was a structure of cycles: planting and harvest, tribute and redistribution, ritual and rest. Each person carried a piece of the burden, their efforts woven together into the survival of a vast city in the middle of a lake. Yet questions linger in the quiet. Did people ever resent the endless obligations? Did they dream of a life free from tribute quotas, school drills, and ritual duties? Or did the weight of order itself become comforting, the predictability of maize planting and market days providing a sense of security in a world where cosmic forces always threatened chaos? By now you can sense how the Aztec world depended not on sudden bursts of glory, but on an endless scaffolding of labor. To see it more clearly, let us look at the infrastructure of their empire. Tenochtitlan was built on an island in the middle of Lake Texcoco, connected to the mainland by 3 great causeways. Each causeway stretched several kilometers, built with stone and packed earth, wide enough for entire processions of people, goods, and armies. They were lined with wooden bridges that could be removed in times of war. But for daily life, they served a more ordinary purpose: the steady march of tribute carriers, traders, and families moving in and out of the city. The causeways were only one part of a vast system. The Aztecs engineered aqueducts to bring fresh water from springs miles away. Imagine 2 stone channels running side by side. While one carried water into the city, the other could be cleaned or repaired. Without this supply, Tenochtitlan could not survive. The salty waters of Lake Texcoco were undrinkable. Maintenance of these aqueducts was constant, requiring crews to dredge debris, repair leaks, and monitor flow. It was not dramatic work, but it kept the city alive. Within the city, canals threaded between neighborhoods like watery streets. Canoes carried people, food, and building materials, but canals required upkeep: weeds removed, banks shored up, silt dredged. Every Kalpuli had obligations to maintain its own section, turning what we might imagine as a picturesque waterway into a daily chore of mud and labor. Flooding was a perpetual threat. To manage it, the Aztecs constructed dikes and levees, including the massive dike of Nezahualcoyotl, stretching nearly 10 miles. Its purpose was simple but essential: to keep brackish water from mixing with the freshwater zones needed for farming. Workers hauled stone, timber, and earth, assembling barriers under the supervision of engineers. These defenses needed constant repair after storms. Each rainy season brought anxiety. Would the dikes hold, or would crops drown beneath rising waters? The city's streets themselves were carefully maintained. Officials enforced cleanliness, requiring households to sweep areas in front of their homes. Trash could not be left to rot. It was collected and repurposed. Human waste, for example, was used as fertilizer. Night soil collectors walked the streets, gathering what households produced. This was not glamorous labor, but it was part of a cycle that kept Chinampas fertile. Even refuse had a place in the grand design. Moving outward, the empire relied on a network of roads and runners. Messengers known as taumames and painani carried loads and information. Taumames were porters, transporting tribute across long distances. They carried goods on their backs with tump lines across their foreheads, walking for days on end. Painani runners worked in relays, sprinting from post to post to deliver messages quickly. Both jobs demanded endurance, and both were largely thankless. But without them, the empire's communications would falter. Inside homes, architecture reflected social status, but also practicality. Commoners lived in small one-room houses made of adobe or reeds, with thatched roofs and a central hearth. Floors were swept daily, mats laid out for sleeping. Wealthier families had larger compounds with plastered walls, courtyards, and separate rooms. Regardless of wealth, household organization centered on shared labor. Families cooked, wove, repaired tools, and stored maize together. Privacy, as we think of it, was rare. Life unfolded in communal spaces where every action was visible. Education reinforced this communal order. We touched earlier on the Kalmakak and Telpochkali, but consider the daily grind of students. They rose before dawn, performed tasks for their teachers, and recited memorized lessons. Discipline was strict. Boys carried heavy loads as practice for military life, while girls learned weaving and food preparation. Singing schools taught ritual chants, requiring endless repetition. For children, life was not play, but preparation, every day structured toward future obligations. Healthcare was also integrated into daily rhythms. Herbalists and midwives formed the backbone of medical practice. They gathered plants from markets or hillsides, preparing poultices and teas. Midwives held honored roles, guiding births with chants and rituals. Healing was not separate from religion. Illnesses were often explained as imbalances with the gods. Treatments required both physical remedies and spiritual observance. Patients endured fasting, bathing, and offerings alongside medicine. The environment itself demanded adaptation. The high valley around Tenochtitlan had a temperate climate, with rainy summers and dry winters. Seasonal rains were vital for crops, but unpredictable. Too much rain meant floods. Too little meant drought. Farmers developed systems to manage both extremes: chinampas for stable yields, terraces on hillsides, and irrigation channels. But these systems required constant labor: repairing terraces, clearing channels, replacing reed mats on chinampas. Nature never paused, so neither could the people. Trade connected the empire outward. Poshtekas, long-distance merchants, traveled for weeks, carrying obsidian, cacao, and luxury goods. Their journeys brought wealth but also risk: bandits, storms, and foreign hostility. At home, families depended on these networks, often without ever leaving their kalpuli. A woman weaving cloth for tribute might never see the distant provinces her work helped sustain, yet her effort rippled outward through trade. Gender roles shaped how this labor was divided. Men carried external duties: warfare, tribute delivery, heavy construction. Women maintained internal systems: cooking, weaving, raising children. But the division was not rigid. In times of absence, women farmed and managed fields, while men sometimes participated in market trade. Survival demanded flexibility, even if social ideals drew sharp lines. Even entertainment had its infrastructure. The ball courts required maintenance, with stone walls repaired and playing surfaces swept. Musicians crafted drums and flutes, practicing endlessly to accompany rituals. Dancers trained for coordinated performances, repeating steps until precision was achieved. These activities looked grand during festivals, but behind them lay hours of preparation, hidden from casual view. Law and governance underpinned it all. Judges sat in marketplaces, resolving disputes over trade. Officials recorded tribute deliveries with pictographs in codices. Inspectors checked weights and measures. Each layer of oversight kept the system stable, but also burdened commoners with scrutiny. Every tortilla sold, every basket of maize counted, every blanket inspected. Bureaucracy was not abstract. It touched daily life constantly. At night, families rested under the quiet hum of insects, but the system continued around them. Watchmen patrolled streets, priests kept temple fires alive, and night soil collectors moved silently with baskets. The city never fully slept. What is striking is not simply the complexity, but the fragility of such systems. One failed dike, one missed tribute, one bad harvest could ripple through the entire empire. People lived with that awareness, though it was rarely spoken aloud. Every act, sweeping a street, repite, ring a canal, grinding maize, was part of a larger balance. Yet one cannot help but wonder, did the sheer weight of maintenance wear on the people? When sweeping the same canal year after year, or carrying maize tribute to officials who would never remember your name, did fatigue turn into resentment? And if so, how long can an empire remain unshaken when its very strength lies in the ceaseless, often invisible, toil of its people? By now we've walked through the rhythms of Aztec life, the grinding stones, the markets, the canals, and the endless systems of obligation. But to complete this journey, we must consider how these routines built towards something larger, how the steady, unremarkable labor of thousands sustained an empire that dazzled even its enemies. A boy trained in the Telpoch Kali, or Kalmakak, eventually grew into a man bound by duty. His military obligations were not occasional distractions but lifelong cycles. Campaign seasons came and went, and he marched when called, carrying supplies and weapons, hoping to prove himself in capture rather than slaughter. His household endured his absences, his wife stretching her weaving and maize preparation to cover the tribute quotas. Returning home meant slipping back into the rhythm of farming, canal repair, and family obligations. For women, adulthood did not alter the trajectory much. From adolescence onward, weaving, cooking, and household rituals consumed the day. Marriage linked two families and their obligations, but it did not ease the grind. A new household meant new quotas of cloth, new fields to tend, new children to raise in discipline. Women carried immense responsibility for continuity. Without their constant labor at the hearth and loom, the empire's tribute system would falter. Priests continued their rigorous paths, rising at dawn to chant prayers, performing self-sacrifice with obsidian blades, and calculating ritual cycles. Their training never ended. Astronomy, mathematics, and ritual knowledge required continual refinement. They oversaw festivals that aligned with agricultural seasons, the ceremonies of planting, rain, and harvest. Each one was elaborate, but beneath the pageantry lay mundane tasks: arranging participants, preparing costumes, timing songs. Priests were administrators of the cosmic order, their grandry, rituals built on thousands of quiet rehearsals. The markets kept the city functioning, and with them came constant regulation. Inspectors checked vendors, scribes recorded exchanges, and runners delivered news of shortages or surpluses. Food was redistributed from tribute warehouses when harvests failed. Even this redistribution required precise measurement and oversight. Nothing moved casually. Every sack of maize, every bundle of firewood, every load of fish was counted, tracked, and logged. Tenochtitlan itself grew in complexity. Canals were expanded, neighborhoods reorganized, and temples rebuilt larger than before. Expansion meant more maintenance, more tribute, more labor. The machine of empire thrived on growth, yet growth multiplied the weight on its people. Households gave not just food and cloth, but also time. Days spent hauling stone, cutting timber, or sweeping temple plazas. A city that looked effortless in its grandeur was, in truth, a web of ceaseless effort. The environment remained a constant challenge. Droughts struck, forcing rationing. Floods breached dikes, destroying crops. Locust plagues descended, devouring maize fields. Each crisis was met with collective labor, rebuilding Chinampas, organizing relief from tribute stores, appealing to gods with new rituals. Survival meant adjusting the cycles, not abandoning them. The empire endured because people accepted the burden of repetition. But repetition carried cost. Tribute demands grew heavier as conquests expanded. Provinces far from the capital carried resentment, sending goods under duress. Inside Tenochtitlan, inequality sharpened. Nobles feasted on cacao and turkey, while commoners survived on plain tortillas. The system remained stable only so long as people believed in its inevitability. And they did, for centuries. The Aztec worldview was built on cycles. The sun rose only because humans fed it with offerings. The maize sprouted only because rituals honored the gods of rain. Time itself was fragile, requiring constant renewal. People accepted their labor not simply as obligation to rulers, but as necessity for cosmic survival. Sweeping a canal was not just civic duty, it was part of keeping the universe intact. Still, cracks existed. Some provinces rebelled, refusing tribute. Some commoners slipped into debt bondage, unable to meet obligations. Some questioned the endless rituals when famine struck, despite offerings. Yet these cracks did not collapse the empire on their own. The system held until outsiders arrived who did not accept its terms. When Spanish conquistadors entered Tenochtitlan in 1519, they marveled at its cleanliness, its markets, its order. To them, it seemed alien, a city of endless labor and precision. What they saw as strangeness was, in truth, the accumulated result of centuries of discipline. But conquest disrupted the cycles. Tribute patterns collapsed, disease swept through Calpulli, and temples fell silent. The machine stopped turning. And yet, the legacy of these ordinary lives did not vanish. The Chinampa system continued to feed communities long after conquest. The weavings of Aztec women became prized textiles in colonial markets. The songs and chants of priests survived in fragments recorded by friars. Even the grinding sound of metates, that endless backdrop of daily life, echoed into the colonial period. Survival left its mark. Today, when we study the Aztecs, it is tempting to focus on the spectacular: temples, warriors, sacrifices. But what truly sustained the empire were the dull, repetitive, often invisible tasks: sweeping, grinding, hauling, weaving. These acts, carried out in millions of repetitions, created the foundation of one of history's most complex societies. So as you drift deeper into the stillness of night, consider this. The empire's grandeur was not built in single moments of glory, but in the quiet persistence of countless ordinary people. Their hands shaped the canals, their shoulders carried the tribute, their voices recited the prayers. And though the empire fell, their labor remains etched in history, a reminder that civilizations rise not on spectacle alone, but on the rhythms of everyday survival. Leaving behind the great lakes and markets of Tenochtitlan, we now cross the seas in imagination, settling into another world defined by discipline and order. Far from the bustle of the Aztec capital, in a rugged corner of Greece, the Spartans built a society unlike any other, rigid, repetitive, and demanding in its own quiet ways. Sparta was not a city of dazzling temples or marketplaces filled with exotic goods. Instead, it was a community structured almost entirely around the preparation for war, though the irony is that most of its people spent their lives not fighting, but enduring the monotony of training, farming, and maintaining the system that upheld the warrior image. To understand Sparta, one must look not only at its soldiers, but also at the countless ordinary rhythms that kept the city-state alive. The foundation of Spartan society was its division into groups. At the top were the Spartiates, full citizens who trained for military service and shared in communal meals. Beneath them lived the Perioikoi, free but non-citizen inhabitants who handled trade and crafts. At the bottom, by far the largest group, were the Helots, enslaved agricultural workers tied to the land, producing the food that sustained Spartan citizens. The lives of these groups intertwined daily, each dependent on the other, though unequally. For the Helots, life was relentless agricultural labor. They tilled fields of barley, tended vineyards, and managed olive groves. Their routines followed the seasons, ploughing in spring, harvesting in summer, pressing olives in autumn, and pruning vines in winter. Tools were simple: wooden ploughs tipped with iron, stone presses for olives, woven baskets for grapes. Work was repetitive and physical, stretching from dawn to dusk. It was their toil that filled the communal mess halls where Spartiate men ate their daily meals. The Spartiates themselves were set apart by their training. From the age of 7, boys entered the agoge, the state-run education and discipline system. Their days were marked by strict schedules, physical drills, endurance exercises, mock battles, and lessons in obedience. Food was deliberately scarce, forcing boys to steal to survive, though being caught meant punishment. The routine was designed not for comfort, but for resilience. Yet much of it was tedious: hours of drilling in formation, memorizing songs and chants, enduring harsh discipline. The glamour of the Spartan warrior was built on years of monotony. Meals illustrate the Spartan ethos. Men gathered in communal dining groups called syssitia, where each contributed food from their estates. The staple was the infamous black broth, a simple mix of pork, blood, vinegar, and salt. It was nourishing, but far from indulgent. Bread, cheese, figs, and wine supplemented the diet, but luxury was frowned upon. Eating was not pleasure, but duty, reinforcing equality among citizens. Even here, helots played a hidden role, producing and delivering the food. Women in Sparta lived differently from those in other Greek city-states. They managed households and estates, especially when men were away for training or war. Women oversaw helot labor, supervised weaving, and ensured contributions to the syssitia were met. They were expected to exercise physically, running and training to ensure strong offspring. While women enjoyed more visibility and autonomy than elsewhere in Greece, their lives were still structured by obligation, maintaining the property and producing children for the state. Governance itself was a routine. Sparta was ruled by a dual kingship, a council of elders, and 5 annually elected ephors. These officials oversaw everything from foreign policy to the daily discipline of the agoge. Court sessions, inspections, and religious rituals filled their calendars. For citizens, participation in the appella, the assembly, was expected, though decisions were often shaped beforehand by the council. Political life was not flamboyant debate, but orderly procedure. Religion blended seamlessly into daily rhythm. Sparta honored gods with regular festivals: the Carnaia, the Gymnopaidia, the Hyacinthia. These festivals involved processions, dances, and athletic competitions. Yet they also required preparation: herding sacrificial animals, baking bread, arranging music. Priests and ordinary citizens alike performed countless small tasks to keep rituals precise. Religion, like training, was less about spectacle than about reinforcing order. The physical environment shaped these patterns. Sparta lay in the fertile Eurotas Valley, ringed by mountains. Winters could be harsh, summers hot, but the river provided irrigation. Helots worked the land intensively, cultivating barley, wheat, olives, and grapes. Shepherds tended flocks of sheep and goats, producing wool and milk. The valley's relative isolation limited trade, which the perioikoi managed in modest fashion. Life revolved around what the land could produce. Daily routines were strict but not glamorous. A Spartiate man rose early, exercised, trained, and shared simple meals with comrades. A woman supervised the household, managing food stores and laborers. A helot walked the fields, bending and lifting until muscles ached. Perioikoi artisans shaped tools, pottery and weapons, their workshops filled with the scrape of metal and the smell of charcoal. These tasks did not make headlines in history, but they kept the system moving. The agoge itself illustrates the monotonous discipline of Spartan life. Boys marched barefoot, wore simple tunics year-round, and slept on reeds they gathered themselves. They were taught to endure hunger, cold, and pain without complaint. Songs and chants drilled collective memory into them. Evenings were spent in discussion or storytelling, guided by elders. What sounds heroic in retrospect was, in lived reality, a long stretch of repetition and hardship. Law was ever present. Spartan officials monitored not just crime, but behavior. Excessive wealth display was frowned upon. Foreign luxuries were restricted. The goal was equality among citizens, maintained through constant surveillance. Helots were kept in fear through the annual declaration of war, which allowed their mistreatment without legal consequence. This practice ensured that their labor continued without rebellion, though resentment simmered beneath the surface. Festivals broke the monotony, but also reinforced structure. The Gymnopaidia, for example, was a festival of dance where young men performed in the heat, their bodies tested by endurance. The Carnea required participants to live in tents, imitating a military camp. These were not festivals of indulgence, but of discipline, mirroring everyday obligations. When night fell, Sparta was quiet. Torches lit the streets, but citizens returned to their barracks or homes. Helots finished their work, storing tools and feeding animals before sleep. Women oversaw weaving looms and food preparation. Children dozed on simple mats. The city rested, but beneath the silence lay the weight of order, pressing down on every household. Sparta's strength lay in this predictability. Each person knew their role, each cycle repeated year after year. Yet one cannot help but wonder, beneath the layers of discipline, did individuals long for change? Did a boy in the agoge dream of a softer life, or a helot in the fields imagine freedom? The structure was stable, but how long can a society endure when its foundation rests on enforced monotony and hidden discontent? The rhythm of Spartan life extended far beyond the borders of the city itself. The carefully balanced system rested on thousands of unseen details, from the sowing of barley in the fields to the clanging of iron in the perioikoi workshops. Every layer of society, every individual task, contributed to a structure that appeared simple, but was in fact deeply complex. To maintain the illusion of stability, each cog in the machine had to turn with predictable regularity. At the heart of this machine was agriculture. The Eurotas Valley provided fertile soil, but its productivity was not automatic. It required constant, repetitive labor. Helots worked the land in organized groups, following a cycle determined by the seasons. In autumn, they plowed fields with oxen, their wooden plows guided along furrows cut by generations before. Seeds of barley and wheat were scattered by hand, covered with light layers of soil. Winter brought pruning of vines and olive trees, tasks performed in the cold, damp air, fingers stiff with frost. Spring meant weeding and irrigation, ensuring the young shoots survived. Summer was the time of harvest, with long days in the heat spent bending, cutting, and gathering. Year after year, these tasks were repeated, unchanged in method, unrelenting in pace. From these labors came the food that sustained the citizens. Barley was ground into coarse meal, baked into bread, or boiled into porridge. Grapes became wine, stored in amphorae lined with pitch to prevent spoilage. Olives yielded both food and oil for lamps. Sheep provided wool for clothing. Goats gave milk and cheese. Yet helots themselves consumed little of what they produced. Most was taken as tribute, handed over to their Spartiate masters. This imbalance was maintained by constant supervision and the ever-present threat of violence. The management of these agricultural resources was itself a matter of routine for Spartan households. Citizen families oversaw their estates, though often at a distance, relying on overseers or trusted women of the household to ensure production met expectations. The state required citizens to contribute regularly to the syssitia, the communal mess. A man who failed to meet his contribution could be excluded, a fate that stripped him of full citizen rights. Thus, the smooth running of farms and the steady work of helots underpinned not just sustenance, but political standing. Beyond agriculture, the perioikoi maintained essential crafts and trade. In their small towns and villages scattered around Laconia, artisans produced pottery, weapons, and tools. Their workshops smelled of charcoal and molten metal, their days marked by the rhythm of hammer on anvil. Perioikoi merchants traveled cautiously to exchange surplus goods with neighboring states, bringing back what Sparta lacked: timber, luxury cloth, or small amounts of foreign coin. Yet trade was never the center of Spartan life. The state discouraged excessive wealth and foreign influence, preferring the steady hum of domestic production to the uncertainty of open markets. The military system, however, absorbed the lion's share of Spartan attention. While the Spartiates themselves trained, drilled, and prepared for war, the logistics of equipping an army rested on others. Blacksmiths forged spears and shields. Tanneries produced leather for armor and sandals. Farmers bred horses, though Spartan cavalry was modest compared to other Greek states. The routine of preparation was constant, even in times of peace. Drill fields echoed with the synchronized steps of soldiers marching, their movements repeated until they became second nature. The agoge, already introduced in the earlier section, deserves further detail, for it was the backbone of the Spartan identity. Boys advanced through stages marked by age. From 7 to 12, they learned endurance and obedience, their days filled with running, wrestling, and memorizing songs. From 12 to 18, training intensified, with harsher discipline, minimal clothing, and deliberate scarcity of food. They were encouraged to steal, but punished if caught, not for theft itself, but for failing at stealth. From 18 onward, young men entered the Crypteia, a secretive institution where select youths roamed the countryside, often tasked with instilling fear among the helots. These rites blurred the line between training and terror, embedding the system of control into the very education of the elite. Spartan women, too, were subject to structured lives. Physical exercise was encouraged: running, discus throwing, even wrestling. Their routines aimed not at personal glory, but at ensuring strong, healthy children. At home, they managed weaving, spinning, and food storage. The clatter of looms filled many Spartan houses, producing the cloth needed for clothing and blankets. Women also managed estate accounts, overseeing helot labor with a firm hand. Their authority was unusual for the Greek world, but it was born not of indulgence, but of necessity. Religion provided another layer of rhythm, woven into daily life with understated persistence. The Spartans honored Artemis Orthia, whose sanctuary stood near the Eurotas River. There, rituals included ordeals for young men who endured beatings while attempting to steal cheese from the altar. Such practices reinforced discipline through shared experience. Festivals punctuated the calendar: sacrifices, dances, athletic competitions, each requiring weeks of preparation. Priests and priestesses performed set rites. Chants were repeated year after year, and processions wound through the streets in patterns as familiar as the seasons. Even governance had its predictable cadence. Ephors convened regularly, inspecting boys in the agoge, reviewing cases in court, and overseeing public discipline. The Gerousia, the Council of Elders, met to debate laws and policies. Their decisions passed to the appella for ratification. Meetings were orderly, voices measured, the outcome often predetermined by hierarchy and tradition. For ordinary citizens, participation was limited to listening, voting, and returning to daily tasks. Sparta's reliance on the Helot population remained its greatest vulnerability, and it was addressed not with reform, but with routine intimidation. Each year, the ephors declared war on the Helots, a ritualized act that allowed their mistreatment without legal consequence. Patrols moved through the countryside, keeping laborers in check. Whispers of rebellion were met with swift, sometimes unseen punishment. For Helots, life was a cycle of labor under shadow, never certain whether the next day would bring another harvest or sudden retribution. The geography of Laconia reinforced these patterns. Isolated by mountains, Sparta relied little on naval trade and remained inward-focused. The Eurotas River, though modest, watered the valley. Irrigation ditches, dug and maintained by Helot hands, guided water to fields. Dry stone walls supported terraces on the hillsides, preventing erosion. The land itself was a silent participant in the Spartan system, its cycles dictating the tempo of labor and the abundance or scarcity of each year's harvest. Day-to-day life thus unfolded in layers. At dawn, Helots rose to tend fields, their voices low as they guided oxen. In the city, boys gathered for training, their bare feet slapping against packed earth. Women organized work within households, assigning tasks to servants and preparing meals. Blacksmiths struck iron, sparks flying into the dim air of their workshops. Officials met in shaded courtyards, discussing matters of law. The pattern was not chaotic, but measured, each part reinforcing the whole. Even leisure was regulated. Music and dance existed, but they followed traditional forms, rehearsed and performed at festivals or communal gatherings. Songs were not spontaneous expressions, but memorized chants, their rhythms used to synchronize marching or commemorate ancestors. Stories told at night emphasized discipline, honor, and loyalty to the state. There was little room for deviation, and even entertainment served the larger structure. Sparta's discipline often fascinates later generations, but when viewed closely, it reveals a society built on relentless monotony. To live as a Spartiate was to surrender individuality to collective order. To live as a Helot was to toil endlessly, one's labor sustaining a system that denied recognition. To live as a Perioikos was to fill the gaps, producing what others required but rarely celebrated. Each group played its role, and the survival of the whole demanded their cooperation. And yet, beneath the surface, tensions persisted. The reliance on Helot labor bred constant unease. The suppression of wealth and luxury limited creativity and growth. The isolation of the valley shielded Sparta, but also constrained it. As the system repeated year after year, one wonders, could such a society adapt to change, or was it destined to fracture when the monotony was disrupted by forces beyond its control? The rhythms of Spartan life extended outward beyond the Eurotas Valley, for no society, however insular, could remain entirely closed. Sparta's reputation as a land of soldiers and order reached other Greek states, shaping both alliances and hostilities. Yet behind this reputation lay the slow, deliberate mechanics of diplomacy, supply, and preparation, activities that were less dramatic than battles but no less essential to survival. When Sparta engaged with other states, it did so through carefully prescribed channels. Envoys traveled under official sanction, carrying the authority of the ephors and the Gerousia. Their journeys were measured in days of walking, their messages memorized or carried on tablets. Discussions with allies or rivals rarely produced immediate action. Instead, they unfolded across weeks or months, with councils debating, reports returning, and decisions filtered through the cautious mechanisms of Spartan governance. The image of Sparta as swift and decisive in war often obscures the slower reality of its diplomacy. The Peloponnesian League, Sparta's network of allies, operated less like an empire and more like a federation. Each member retained autonomy, but pledged military support under Spartan leadership. To maintain this system required constant negotiation. Sparta had to reassure allies of its protection, suppress dissent, and occasionally send officials to oversee disputes. The logistics of such oversight were repetitive. Dispatches prepared, messengers sent, garrisons rotated. No single action stood out, yet without them the structure would collapse. Warfare itself, so central to the Spartan identity, relied on preparation as much as combat. Campaigns could only be launched when the seasons allowed, fields needed planting or harvest, and festivals required observance. Soldiers marched not as individuals, but in phalanxes, their movement was rehearsed endlessly in training. Shields were checked, spears sharpened, tunics repaired. Provisions were gathered, barley meal for bread, dried figs, salted meat. Pack animals were loaded, and supply wagons creaked along narrow roads. The army moved with order, but the order was born of unglamorous repetition. Even the act of marching required planning. Distances were measured by days rather than miles, with halts scheduled near rivers or springs. Camps were arranged in standardized patterns, tents pitched in rows, cooking fires lit at designated spots. Watch rotations were assigned, with men waking in the cold hours before dawn to pace the perimeter. For every moment of battle, there were weeks of such routines, endless cycles of eating, marching, drilling, and waiting. The Spartans' religious obligations accompanied them into the field. Sacrifices were performed before campaigns, auguries sought from animal entrails, omens read in the flight of birds. If signs were unfavorable, departure could be delayed. These rituals were not mere superstition but embedded requirements. Without proper observance, the army risked disfavor from the gods, and no commander dared proceed in violation. Thus, divine consultation became another layer of logistical routine, shaping the very calendar of war. Within Sparta, the management of resources for warfare was constant. Helots tilled fields to provide surplus for soldiers away on campaign. Women oversaw estates, ensuring contributions to the Syssitia continued uninterrupted. Artisans repaired weapons in anticipation of future conflicts. Even during peace, the hum of preparation never ceased. The society existed in a perpetual state of readiness, its stability dependent on the expectation that war could come at any season. Sparta's interactions with the wider Greek world were not confined to war and alliance. Religious festivals at pan-Hellenic sanctuaries such as Olympia or Delphi brought Spartans into contact with other states. Delegations traveled in orderly groups, participating in sacrifices and competitions. Their presence was marked not by flamboyance, but by uniformity. Simple cloaks, disciplined bearing, minimal ornament. At Olympia, Spartans competed in athletic events, demonstrating the physical prowess that their society cultivated. Victories there reinforced their prestige, though such triumphs were treated as communal achievements rather than personal glory. Trade, though limited, still occurred through perioikoi intermediaries. Iron bars sometimes served as currency, deliberately inconvenient to discourage hoarding of wealth. Foreign luxuries entered slowly, a carved cup here, a piece of fine cloth there. But these items remained rare, absorbed quietly into households without altering the broader simplicity of Spartan life. What mattered most was not material accumulation, but the continuation of established routines. Sparta's rigidity, however, also created difficulties in adapting to external pressures. Other Greek states developed navies, expanded trade networks, and experimented with political systems. Sparta remained rooted in its traditions. Ships were built sparingly, relying on allies for naval strength. Commerce was kept at arm's length. The dual kingship and council system remained unchanged, resistant to innovation. This conservatism provided stability, but also risked stagnation. The tension between order and change appeared most clearly in Sparta's response to crises. Earthquakes, which occasionally struck the valley, disrupted the delicate balance. Houses collapsed, temples cracked, and fields required renewed labor. Helots, seizing opportunities in the chaos, sometimes rose in rebellion. Spartan responses followed familiar patterns. Assemblies convened, patrols intensified, punishments delivered. Yet each disruption revealed the fragility of a system so dependent on control. For ordinary Spartans, these crises were not moments of political drama, but of personal adjustment. A collapsed roof required rebuilding. Fields needed replanting after floods. Families absorbed losses quietly, relying on communal support where possible. The state provided little in the way of relief. Survival rested on persistence and adherence to routine. The helots, as always, bore the heaviest burdens. During military campaigns, they accompanied soldiers as attendants, carrying supplies, cooking meals, and tending animals. Their labor extended the endurance of Spartan armies, though their presence remained unacknowledged in official accounts. When not in the field, they continued their endless cycles of farming, weaving, and carrying. Their lives blurred into repetition, essential yet hidden. For Spartan boys and youths, external campaigns served as both trial and lesson. Marching through foreign territories, they observed other ways of life. Markets bustling with trade, homes adorned with luxuries, assemblies open to broader participation. Yet these observations did not translate into change at home. Instead, they reinforced the belief that Sparta's austerity was strength, its order superior to perceived excess. The seasons continued to dictate the larger rhythm. Autumn harvests determined winter supplies. Spring festivals marked renewal, with sacrifices ensuring divine favor for the coming year. Summer brought opportunities for campaigns, while winter often restricted movement. Through it all, the cycle of training, farming, and governance continued without interruption. The city itself seemed to breathe in this measured rhythm, inhaling at Lanting, exhaling at harvest, steady and controlled. Even the built environment reflected this predictability. Spartan houses were simple, constructed of mud, brick, and wood, with minimal ornament. Streets followed practical lines rather than grand designs. Public spaces served functional purposes: training grounds, mess halls, sanctuaries. Unlike Athens, with its theatres and painted temples, Sparta presented little spectacle. Its beauty lay in order and restraint, a physical manifestation of its values. Yet the question lingered: could such restraint endure indefinitely? A society so dependent on suppression, so resistant to change, inevitably faced pressures from within and without. The helots' discontent simmered beneath the surface. Allies sometimes chafed under Spartan leadership. Rivals sought to challenge its dominance. Each threat was managed through routine measures: patrols, assemblies, treaties. But no routine can hold forever against shifting tides. The ordinary life of Sparta, with its steady cycles of labor, training, and governance, thus carried within it the seeds of its own challenges. As long as the rhythms held, the system appeared unshakable. But history rarely allows rhythms to continue unchanged. What would happen when Sparta's order encountered forces it could not absorb into its patterns? Sparta's history has often been remembered in fragments of legend: warriors standing firm at Thermopylae, laconic sayings delivered with wit, and a society portrayed as uniquely harsh. Yet the lived reality, stretched across centuries, was less dramatic and more enduring. To understand Sparta's legacy, one must look not only at its moments of battle, but at the quiet persistence of its daily systems, the repetition of routines that defined generations. The dual kingship, so unusual among Greek states, encapsulated Sparta's emphasis on balance. Two hereditary rulers, drawn from separate royal houses, reigned simultaneously. Each king commanded in war, performed religious rites, and held symbolic authority. Yet neither could act unchecked. The ephors supervised, the gerousia advised, and the assembly of citizens voted. Decisions emerged not from sudden bursts of charisma, but from careful, layered processes. For centuries, this structure prevented domination by a single ruler. It did not eliminate conflict, but it maintained continuity. At the core of Spartan stability lay its citizens' willingness to subordinate personal ambition to collective order. Wealth, though present, was muted. Aristocratic families managed estates, but public display was restrained. Prestige came less from luxury than from reputation for discipline. Even victors in the Olympic Games were celebrated modestly, their achievements absorbed into the city's communal pride. This restraint discouraged factionalism, preserving the unity required to manage the helot majority. The syssitia, those shared meals of barley bread, pork stew, and diluted wine, became a powerful equalizer. Men sat together regardless of wealth, contributing from their estates but receiving the same fare. The act of dining side by side reinforced solidarity, evening out disparities. Discussions at these meals were measured. Voice is kept low, decisions filtered through consensus. Day after day, year after year, these ordinary dinners maintained cohesion in a way decrees alone could not. Education, too, reinforced continuity. The agoge, beginning at age 7, trained boys not merely in physical endurance, but in conformity to communal expectations. Lessons were harsh, but their purpose lay in shaping character suited to the polis. Stealth, obedience, endurance of hunger and cold, all became ordinary expectations. Each boy's hardships mirrored those of his peers, producing citizens who thought of themselves less as individuals and more as extensions of the collective. Spartan women, though excluded from political rights, shaped the society's endurance in subtler ways. Their oversight of estates allowed men to dedicate themselves fully to military obligations. Their management of households ensured contributions to the syssitia continued without interruption. Their voices, though absent in assemblies, echoed in the upbringing of children, instilling values of discipline and resilience. In this way, women underpinned the very system that constrained them. Religion, integrated into every aspect of life, provided another layer of stability. Festivals punctuated the year, marking transitions of season and reaffirming community bonds. Sacrifices to Artemis Orthia, Apollo, and other deities reminded Spartans of divine oversight. The observance of rituals during campaigns tied the rhythm of war to that of worship. The gods were ever present, their favor sought in entrails and omens, their temples steady centers in the city's life. For centuries, this combination of governance, discipline, and religion sustained Sparta. Its reputation spread throughout Greece, shaping how others perceived it. Allies valued its military leadership. Rivals respected its endurance. The city became a symbol of order in a WW, old, often marked by change. Yet the very qualities that preserved its identity also limited its adaptability. As other states embraced commerce, Sparta remained wary. While Athens built fleets and colonies, Sparta relied on allies for naval power. While Corinth thrived on trade, Sparta restricted currency and luxuries. These choices preserved austerity, but left Sparta less able to respond to economic and technological shifts. Its strength remained rooted in land-based infantry, formidable yet increasingly insufficient in a changing world. The Peloponnesian War tested these foundations. Sparta, leading its league, clashed with Athens in a struggle that stretched nearly 3 decades. Victory eventually came, but it was not without cost. Resources strained, populations diminished, and the reliance on allies deepened. The war revealed both the endurance of Spartan routines and their vulnerabilities. Success came through persistence and alliance, not through dramatic transformation. In the generations that followed, Sparta's influence waned. The rigid social system, so effective in maintaining cohesion, struggled to accommodate shifts in population and wealth. The citizen body declined in number, reducing the pool of men eligible for full participation. Landholding became concentrated in fewer hands, undermining the equality that once bound citizens together. Attempts at reform faltered, resisted by tradition and entrenched interests. Yet even in decline, the image of Sparta persisted. Philosophers and historians, from Plato to Xenophon, reflected on its order as a model of discipline. Roman admirers, centuries later, cited Spartan austerity as an ideal of virtue. The city's modest ruins contrasted with the grand monuments of Athens, but its reputation endured in texts and tales. What survived was less the material legacy than the memory of its way of life. For the ordinary Spartans who lived through these centuries, the experience was not of grand battles or philosophical debats, but of continued routine. Fields were ploughed, harvests gathered, mess contributions made, festivals observed. Boys still entered the agoge, men still dined in syssitia, women still managed estates. Even as numbers dwindled and power declined, the patterns held. Continuity persisted at the level of daily life long after Sparta's dominance faded. The Helots, too, remained bound to the land, their labor sustaining the system even in its reduced state. Their discontent occasionally flared, but repression followed familiar patterns. To them, Spartan decline may have seemed less a dramatic fall than a continuation of hardship under slightly altered masters. Their lives, marked by toil and subordination, changed little with the shifting fortunes of the ruling class. The physical landscape preserved traces of the society's endurance. Fields around the Eurotas continued to produce grain and olives. Sanctuaries maintained their rituals, though on smaller scales. The training grounds remained, echoing faintly with the shouts of youths in drills. While other cities left behind marble monuments, Sparta's legacy lay in these humble continuities. In reflecting on Sparta's history, one sees less a tale of sudden rise and fall than of prolonged stability, followed by gradual erosion. Its greatness lay not in fleeting victories, but in centuries of disciplined persistence. Its decline was not catastrophe but attrition, a slow diminishment of numbers and influence. This very slowness ensured that Sparta's rhythms left a lasting impression. Today, when one thinks of Sparta, it is often through images of warriors, of shields locked in phalanx, of terse sayings uttered with resolve. Yet the deeper reality lies in the quieter details, the endless training drills, the shared bowls of barley stew, the rotations of watchmen, the measured debates of councils, the steady tilling of fields by unseen hands. These were the true foundations of Sparta, the elements that sustained it across centuries. Sparta's legacy, then, is twofold. It is a reminder of the power of order, discipline, and restraint to preserve a community against external pressures. But it is also a cautionary tale of the dangers of inflexibility, of a society so committed to tradition that it could not adapt to change. Its greatness and its limitations were two sides of the same coin, inseparable from one another. As the centuries passed, Sparta diminished into a quieter existence, remembered more than experienced. Travelers in later ages remarked on the simplicity of its ruins, noting the absence of grandeur, but acknowledging the weight of memory. The city that had once commanded Greece left behind not soaring temples or sprawling harbors, but an enduring idea of discipline. And so the story of Sparta concludes not with a dramatic collapse, but with reflection. It was a society that valued sameness over change, routine over innovation, discipline over comfort. Its people lived and died within narrow patterns, finding meaning in repetition. In the end, its greatest monument was not built of stone, but inscribed in memory, a rhythm of life that, though long faded, continues to echo in history. From the rugged hills of Greece, where Spartan voices echoed in austere halls, we move eastward and back in time, to the flat plains between the Tigris and Euphrates. Here, long before phalanxes marched or councils debated, people organized themselves around rivers whose seasonal moods determined everything. The land of Mesopotamia, often called the cradle of civilization, was not a single unified kingdom, but a patchwork of city-states. Each settlement, from Ur to Lagash, from Babylon to Nippur, balanced ambition with survival. The rivers gave life, but they also demanded constant vigilance. Without their waters, fields lay barren. With too much flooding, crops were destroyed. And so, from the beginning, Mesopotamian life revolved around managing water. Irrigation systems stretched outward from the rivers, channels dug and maintained by hand. Each year, after the spring floods, communities repaired the ditches, cleared silt, and rebuilt embankments. It was dull work, repeated without fail, but it secured the harvest. Families depended on barley, the staple crop that withstood the region's salty soils. Alongside barley grew wheat, dates, onions, garlic, and lentils. Herds of sheep and goats grazed on the drier ground, their wool and milk providing both sustenance and trade goods. Work was organized seasonally. In the early months of the year, ploughing and sowing dominated the countryside. Farmers used simple wooden ploughs tipped with copper or bronze, pulled by oxen whose pace set the rhythm of planting. During summer, irrigation channels needed constant attention. Weeds had to be cleared, gates adjusted to ensure each field received water. Autumn brought the harvest, stalks cut by sickles, bundles carried on the shoulders of laborers. Winter, though cooler, was no time of rest. Repairs to tools, weaving of cloth, and preparation for the next cycle filled the months. Ordinary lives rarely strayed far from these cycles. The majority of Mesopotamians were tied to the land, paying portions of their harvest as rent, tax, or temple offering. Surplus grain moved into storehouses, often controlled by temple or palace officials. Clay tablets recorded amounts owed and delivered, ensuring accountability. What might seem tedious to us, markings pressed into wet clay with a reed stylus, was to them the machinery of survival. Bureaucracy, in its earliest form, was born from barley rations and irrigation rosters. In the cities, life unfolded along narrow streets of mud-brick houses. Roofs were flat, providing space for drying crops or sleeping on hot nights. Courtyards formed the center of homes, where cooking fires burned and families gathered. Pottery stored grain and oil. Reed mats softened the floors. Craftsmen worked in small workshops, potters turning clay on wheels, metalworkers hammering copper, weavers producing textiles. Markets buzzed with exchange, barley for fish, wool for dates, copper tools for finished cloth. Coins did not yet exist. Value was measured in weights of silver, though most transactions relied on barter. Temples dominated city skylines, with ziggurats rising step by step toward the heavens. These massive platforms, built of sun-dried brick, required endless maintenance as rains eroded their surfaces. Priests managed not only rituals but also economic life. Temple complexes owned fields, flocks, and workshops. Workers owed labor to the temple just as they did to the palace. Offerings of food and goods kept the gods appeased and the institution supplied. Religion, bureaucracy, and survival were inseparable. Education was limited but specialized. Scribes trained from youth memorized symbols and practiced stylus strokes on discarded clay. Hours of repetitive copying built skill, their hands pressing thousands of tiny wedge-shaped marks into tablets. They recorded contracts, lists, prayers, hymns, and even school exercises. To be a scribe meant security and prestige, but it also meant years of monotonous training. Yet without them, records of harvests, laws, and treaties could not endure. The quiet persistence of their work kept cities functioning. Mesopotamian law codes reveal the dull realities of disputes, compensation for damaged irrigation channels, penalties for stolen livestock, rules governing inheritance. These were not heroic tales but guidelines for keeping order. If a farmer diverted water without permission, he might face a fine of grain. If a builder constructed a house poorly and it collapsed, he bore responsibility for damages. Life was regulated through detail, each article of law reflecting practical concerns. Even leisure was structured by routine. Beer, brewed from barley, was consumed daily, often through long straws from communal jars. Music, played on lyres and drums, accompanied festivals, but also filled taverns. Storytelling, preserved in epic form like that of Gilgamesh, carried moral lessons, but also entertained. Yet for most, leisure was brief, squeezed between long hours in field or workshop. The environment added constant challenge. Salinization of soil threatened yields, forcing farmers to adjust crops or abandon fields. Floods could wash away homes. Droughts could reduce canals to dust. Nomadic groups pressed against settled lands, seeking pasture or plunder. Each generation learned anew that security was fragile. Adaptation required both collective labor and bureaucratic record-keeping. To walk through a Mesopotamian city in its prime was to encounter noise and dust, the bray of donkeys, the calls of traders, the smoke of hearths. Yet beneath the bustle lay predictable rhythms. Grain shipments moved along canals. Officials checked tablets against deliveries. Families needed bread from flour measured carefully to last the week. It was not a world of constant drama, but of persistent effort, repeated endlessly. And so the question arises, in a land where survival depended so heavily on water, record-keeping and routine, how much freedom did ordinary people truly feel? Did they see their lives as shaped by choice, or as bound by the same cycles that guided their parents and would govern their children? The rivers shaped the fields. But it was in the cities that Mesopotamian life revealed its intricate organization. Beyond the mud-brick walls and narrow alleys lay networks of responsibility that touched every household, whether humble or wealthy. Survival was not simply about growing barley or tending flocks. It was about belonging to a system that demanded contributions, recorded transactions, and balanced obligations between temple, palace, and family. At the center of most cities rose two distinct but connected powers. The temple, with its ziggurat and sprawling courtyards, represented the gods. Priests managed land, livestock, and workshops in the name of divine guardianship. Offerings flowed into storerooms, redistributed not just for ritual, but for community support in times of need. Parallel to the temple stood the palace, residence of kings or governors. From here radiated authority over law, defense, and trade. The two institutions often overlapped, priests advising rulers, rulers sponsoring rituals, but their coexistence created a balance that shaped urban life. Ordinary families navigated this structure through taxes and service. A farmer, after harvesting barley, owed a share to both palace and temple. Deliveries were carefully measured with standardized weights, recorded by scribes. If shortfalls occurred, debt could accumulate. Families might pledge labor, livestock, or even members of their household as repayment. Debt was not rare. Clay tablets preserve countless records of loans and obligations. The system could be unforgiving, yet it ensured steady flows of goods into central storehouses. Craftsmen were equally bound. Potters, metalworkers, and weavers often worked in workshops overseen by palace or temple administrators. Production was organized to meet quotas, textiles for trade, tools for farmers, vessels for storage. While some artisans gained interdependence by selling goods in markets, many remained tied to institutional demands. Their skills were valued, but their autonomy was limited by the needs of larger systems. Markets formed the visible heart of exchange. Unlike the organized quotas delivered to palace and temple, markets offered flexibility. Families bartered surplus goods, a jar of dates for a measure of fish, a woolen cloak for a copper blade. Merchants specialized in moving goods across distances, bringing timber from Lebanon, metals from Anatolia, or lapis lazuli from Afghanistan. These items, rare and valued, flowed into temples and palaces as symbols of prestige. For common people, markets provided more modest exchanges: tools, food, household wares. Trade required regulation. Standardized weights of silver served as reference, even when barter dominated. Officials inspected scales, punished fraud, and resolved disputes. Contracts were inscribed on tablets, sealed with personal cylinder seals rolled across wet clay. These seals, carved with unique patterns, marked identity and authority. A simple exchange of livestock could generate a clay tablet that endured for centuries, a testament to bureaucratic precision. Governance extended beyond trade into law and justice. Codes, like the famous laws of Hammurabi, codified expectations. While the most striking provisions dealt with crime and punishment, much of the code addressed property, labor, and family. What happened if irrigation channels were neglected? How were debts repaid? What share of inheritance did children receive? These matters, ordinary yet essential, kept society stable. Judges, appointed by rulers, heard disputes, relying on written contracts as evidence. Military service also tied households to the state. Farmers might be called to defend canals or city walls. Weapons were simple: spears, bows, shields, but mobilization required organization. Palaces stored weapons and provisions, ensuring readiness. Campaigns against rival cities were frequent, though not always grand. Skirmishes over fields or water rights could escalate, drawing in whole communities. Victory often meant tribute rather than destruction, grain, livestock, or labor extracted from defeated neighbors. Despite the weight of obligation, Mesopotamian life was not solely toil. Festivals punctuated the year, tied to agricultural and religious cycles. During New Year celebrations in Babylon, processions carried statues of gods through the streets, reaffirming divine protection. Markets swelled, music filled courtyards, and even ordinary people shared in feasting. These events, though rare compared to daily grind, reinforced a sense of belonging. Household life carried its own rhythms. Families rose early, with women preparing bread from barley flour, grinding grain on stone querns. Children fetched water from wells or canals, carried in clay jars balanced on shoulders. Men tended fields, repaired tools, or joined work crews on canals. Evenings gathered the family back in courtyards, meals shared from common bowls, conversations carried under fading light. These routines, repeated across generations, bound communities together more than edicts or rituals. Education remained the domain of scribes, yet its impact touched all. Contracts, loans, and accounts required literacy, if not by the signers, then by witnesses. The presence of writing meant that even illiterate farmers lived under its influence, their obligations pressed into clay. The stylus of a scribe could determine ownership of land, terms of repayment, or settlement of disputes. Writing, though tedious, in its practice, wielded immense power in shaping ordinary lives. Foreign contact added layers of complexity. Caravans brought not only goods, but also ideas and influences. Styles of pottery, techniques of metalworking, and even myths traveled along trade routes. The story of a great flood, preserved in Mesopotamian epics, resonates with later traditions across regions. Cultural exchange unfolded quietly, embedded in trade and migration, yet it shaped identities over centuries. Temples, ever central, absorbed much of this wealth and knowledge. Their storerooms held not just grain, but imported goods. Their scribes recorded treaties as well as rituals. Palaces relied on these institutions, yet also competed with them for authority. The balance shifted across centuries. Sometimes rulers dominated, sometimes priests held sway. For common people, the distinction mattered little. Both demanded service, both framed life in obligations. Amid this structure, inequality deepened. Nobles and high officials lived in larger homes, owned estates, and consumed luxuries like meat and fine textiles. Commoners subsisted on barley bread, onions, and beer, their homes modest and their clothing simple. Slavery existed, often as a result of debt or war, adding another layer to the hierarchy. Yet even among the lowest, participation in community life, market exchange, festivals, canal maintenance, offered a sense of belonging. The system, with all its detail, endured because it distributed responsibility. Irrigation required collective effort. Trade required trust and records. Defense required mobilization. No single household could stand apart. Survival meant cooperation within the frameworks of temple and palace. These frameworks, though demanding, provided structure that withstood floods, droughts, and conflict, but stability carried tension. What happened when obligations grew too heavy? When debts accumulated beyond repayment? When rulers demanded more tribute than families could supply? The clay tablets preserve glimpses of these pressures, records of debt slavery, petitions for relief, disputes over land. The system balanced, but precariously. And so we end this section with a question. In a society so meticulously organized, did people feel protected by its order or trapped within its demands? Did they trust that temple and palace worked for the common good, or did they sense that the weight of obligation might one day press too heavily to bear? The rivers gave food, the city gave structure, but for the people of Mesopotamia, the gods gave meaning. Every field, every harvest, every flood, and every illness was interpreted through the lens of divine will. To live in the land between the Tigris and Euphrates was to accept that life's rhythms were entangled with forces far greater than human effort. Temples stood as the visible reminder, but the belief ran through every home, every market, and every act of daily life. The pantheon was vast, layered with local and regional deities. Anu, the sky god, stood at the head, though distant and abstract. Enlil, lord of wind and storm, carried immense authority, associated with kingship and destiny. Ea, or Enki, god of wisdom and fresh waters, was viewed as a benefactor, clever in providing solutions. Inanna, later known as Ishtar, embodied fertility and war, embodying both love and conflict. Shamash, the sun god, governed justice, while Nanna, the moon god, watched over cycles of time. Each city had its patron deity, housed in its temple, cared for with offerings and rituals. The temple routine was steady and deliberate. Priests woke early, purifying themselves before entering sacred spaces. Statues of gods, carefully crafted and ritually enlivened, received daily care, washing, dressing, and feeding. Meals of bread, beer, and meat were set before them, as if the divine figures truly consumed the offerings. After ceremonies, the food did not go to waste. Portions were redistributed among temple staff, ensuring that ritual also sustained human needs. Festivals amplified these routines. In Babylon, the New Year festival, known as Akitu, lasted days. Statues of gods were paraded through streets, carried on platforms by priests. Crowds gathered, chanting hymns, watching as deities symbolically visited one another's temples. The king played a central role, ritually humble, before the statue of Marduk, confessing failings before being reaffirmed as ruler. The cycle of renewal linked cosmic order to political authority, ensuring both were seen as aligned. Divination filled the spaces between festivals. Priests and specialists sought to interpret the will of the gods through signs. The movement of stars, the shape of clouds, the flight of birds, each carried potential meaning. Liver divination was especially prominent. A sacrificed animal's liver was examined for marks or irregularities, believed to reveal divine intentions. Clay models of livers survive, inscribed with guidance for interpretation, evidence of the painstaking effort to standardize this practice. Ordinary people engaged with divination at a more immediate level. Household amulets, inscribed with protective prayers, guarded against illness and misfortune. Incantations were recited over the sick, blending practical remedies with spiritual intervention. If a child fell ill, parents might consult a healer who combined herbs with ritual formulas. Every ailment had both physical and spiritual dimensions, demanding attention on both fronts. Dreams, too, were seen as messages. Manuals recorded lists of dream images and their possible meanings. To dream of water might suggest abundance, of fire might warn of danger. These interpretations circulated widely, guiding decisions as mundane as planting schedules or as weighty as marriage arrangements. The boundary between divine message and daily planning was thin. Cosmic order was imagined as fragile, requiring constant maintenance. Floods, droughts, and invasions were interpreted not just as natural events, but as signs of divine displeasure. Rituals of appeasement followed, extra offerings, confessions of communal guilt, or even substitutions in times of crisis. The concept of the substitute king illustrates this vividly. If omens predicted disaster for the ruler, a stand-in was temporarily crowned, absorbing the danger meant for the king. After the period passed, the substitute was removed, sometimes executed, sometimes dismissed, while the true king resumed authority. The logic was grim but consistent with the belief that destiny could be negotiated through ritual. For most people, however, religion was woven into quieter routines. Small household altars offered space for prayers to protective spirits. Clay figurines represented deities or demons set in corners or buried beneath thresholds. These were not grand festivals, but ordinary acts of protection. Lighting a lamp, pouring a libation of beer, or offering a pinch of flour carried significance. The line between the sacred and the domestic blurred in these acts. Scribes played a role here as well. They recorded hymns, incantations, and ritual instructions, ensuring continuity across generations. Collections of omens filled clay libraries, copied meticulously by students. Temples often maintained archives of these texts, enabling priests to consult precedent when interpreting signs. Knowledge was cumulative, growing slowly as tablets piled up in storerooms. Even when dynasties fell, scribes preserved the traditions, ensuring continuity through upheaval. Astronomy and calendar keeping were particularly important. The moon's cycles guided months, festivals, and agricultural planning. Observations of eclipses, planetary movements, and star risings were carefully noted. Link led to predictions about weather, harvest, and politics. These records, systematic and long-term, reflect both religious devotion and practical necessity. By watching the skies, Mesopotamians aligned themselves with what they believed to be divine order, while also gaining tools to anticipate seasonal change. The worldview extended beyond the living. Death was not imagined as a reward or punishment, but as a descent to a shadowy underworld. The dead existed in dim conditions, requiring offerings from the living to sustain them. Families poured libations through clay pipes into graves, ensuring ancestors were not forgotten. Neglect risked unrest, as spirits deprived of sustenance might trouble the living. This practice linked households across generations, binding the living and the dead in ongoing responsibility. Myths reinforced these ideas. The Epic of Gilgamesh, preserved on clay tablets, tells of a king's quest for immortality. His failure underscored a common truth. Humans were destined for mortality, the gods for eternity. Yet the epic also conveyed resilience. Gilgamesh returns to his city, recognizing that enduring works, like walls and institutions, provide meaning beyond individual lifespan. The lesson aligned with daily life. While individuals perished, the structures of community, ritual, and writing endured. Religion also mediated politics. Kings often justified authority through divine mandate. Victory in war was framed as the will of the gods, failure as their displeasure. In inscriptions, rulers boasted not only of conquests, but of temple restorations, presenting themselves as caretakers of divine order. Building or repairing a ziggurat was as much a political act as a religious one. This intertwining could create tension. What if omens contradicted political needs? What if priests read disaster in the skies just as rulers planned campaigns? Negotiations followed, sometimes leading to modified rituals, sometimes to suppressed interpretations. The need to align divine will with human ambition required constant effort, a negotiation not unlike the balancing of tribute or trade. Yet despite complexity, religion gave people coherence. In a land vulnerable to floods and droughts, belief provided a framework for understanding uncertainty. Rituals did not guarantee success, but they offered structure. When canals overflowed, priests could declare it a message, prescribe offerings, and reaffirm the community's bond with its gods. Without such interpretations, disaster might feel meaningless. With them, hardship became part of a narrative, manageable, if not preventable. The detail of Mesopotamian religion might appear overwhelming. Endless rituals, careful omens, constant attention to signs. But this very detail was its strength. By multiplying rituals, multiplying interpretations, Mesopotamians created a buffer against chaos. No single sign determined destiny. Multiple rituals offered multiple chances to restore balance. The system was demanding, but it kept anxiety contained within a structure of meaning. Still, questions lingered. Did ordinary farmers truly believe every omen, every ritual? Or did some comply out of obligation, treating rituals as another tax of time and goods? Were there skeptics, silent in their doubt, or did belief permeate so fully that alternatives never arose? The tablets preserve formulas and records, but the inner thoughts of the majority remain hidden. And so we end this section with uncertainty. In a world where every star, every storm, and every sickness might carry divine meaning, how did individuals navigate their privat to doubts? Did they find comfort in ritual repetition, or did some quietly wonder if the gods truly listened at all? The land between the rivers did not last as a single civilization. Empires rose and fell, kings claimed glory and then were forgotten, and cities that once dominated trade dwindled into ruins. Yet the patterns established in Mesopotamia shaped much of what came afterward. To reflect on their legacy is to see how ordinary details, clay, canals, ledgers, rituals, echoed far beyond their original time. The most visible contribution was writing. Cuneiform, impressed on clay with a reed stylus, began as a system of accounting. Lists of barley, sheep, or beer rations filled the earliest tablets. Over centuries, it expanded into a full script, capable of recording literature, law, and correspondence. The Epic of Gilgamesh, hymns to gods, and royal decrees all traveled by way of wedge-shaped impressions. Other regions adapted or borrowed aspects of the system, and scribal schools kept the tradition alive for millennia. Even after cuneiform faded, the principle of written record endured, carried forward into alphabetic scripts and beyond. Law was another lasting innovation. Hammurabi's code, carved into stone around 1750 BCE, is one of the earliest known law collections. It organized penalties for theft, trade disputes, and injuries, establishing a principle of proportionate justice, an eye for an eye. Though not unique in its concern for order, its preservation in monumental form influenced later legal traditions. The idea that laws could be codified, displayed, and invoked as a shared standard traced a path from Mesopotamian courts to later legal systems across the Mediterranean and beyond. Agricultural practices, though less celebrated, also left deep marks. Irrigation management required collective effort, detailed planning, and constant upkeep. The canals of Mesopotamia prefigured later hydraulic societies, demonstrating both potential and peril. When managed well, canals brought abundance. When neglected or misaligned, they caused salinization and collapse. Lessons from their successes and failures inform understandings of human-environment interaction even today. The rhythm of planting barley, rotating fields, and measuring water levels in simple clay devices showed an early sophistication in balancing human needs with natural constraints. Religion, though particular in form, influenced neighboring cultures. Myths of floods, descent to the underworld, and divine kingship circulated widely. Some scholars see echoes of Mesopotamian stories in later Hebrew, Greek, and Near Eastern traditions. The Epic of Gilgamesh's flood narrative parallels accounts in other texts, suggesting a shared cultural reservoir. Ritual structures, such as temple economies and ceremonial kingship, resonated in successor societies, though adapted to new contexts. Even when specific gods faded, the patterns of connecting political authority with divine sanction endured. Administration was perhaps the most practical legacy. The Mesopotamian habit of recording goods, assigning rations, and storing tablets in archives established models of bureaucracy. Scribes tracked everything from livestock to labor obligations, creating a paper, or rather clay, trail of accountability. This culture of record-keeping spread as empires expanded, forming the backbone of governance. Without such systems, coordination of large states would have been difficult. In a sense, the modern office owes part of its ancestry to Mesopotamian temple storerooms, lined with labeled tablets. Urbanism also carried forward. Cities like Uruk, Ur, and Babylon demonstrated how dense populations could be sustained through specialization and trade. The layout of streets, the central role of temples, and the reliance on imported goods set patterns repeated in later centers. While materials changed, stone in Greece, brick in Rome, The core idea of concentrated settlements tied to administrative hubs remained constant. Urban life, with its opportunities and tensions, spread outward from the experiments in the floodplain. Even failure provided lessons. Mesopotamian lands suffered from salinization as irrigation raised salt levels in soil. Yields declined, prompting shifts from wheat to more salt-tolerant barley. Eventually, some fields became unusable. This ecological feedback illustrated the long-term costs of intensive farming, a pattern echoed in later societies facing soil exhaustion. The record, inscribed in both texts and sediments, warns of the fragile balance between human ambition and environmental limits. For ordinary people, legacies were less monumental, but no less real. The shape of daily labor, tilling fields, grinding grain, hauling water, continued across generations, not only in Mesopotamia, but wherever similar conditions arose. The tools might differ, but the principle of coordinated effort under administrative oversight persisted. Modern workers might recognize in the ration lists a distant echo of wages and schedules, the enduring link between labor and account. The memory of Mesopotamia itself shifted over time. By the first millennium BCE, Assyrians and Babylonians looked back on earlier Sumerians as cultural ancestors, preserving their texts and rituals. Later, Greek travelers marveled at the ruins, recording stories of hanging gardens and great walls. In the 19th century CE, excavation of sites like Nineveh and Ur revealed tablets long buried, rekindling interest in what had once been forgotten. The rediscovery of cuneiform unlocked an archive spanning thousands of years, reshaping modern understanding of early civilization. The reflection is not purely celebratory. For all their achievements, Mesopotamian societies were marked by inequality, slavery, and constant warfare. Ordinary farmers carried heavy burdens of labor and tribute. Conquered peoples endured forced relocations. The grandeur of ziggurats was built on the backs of those with little choice. Recognizing legacy requires acknowledging both brilliance and brutality, the coexistence of creativity and coercion. Yet within this mixture lies their enduring significance. Mesopotamians demonstrated how humans could organize at scale, feeding cities, coordinating trade, recording agreements, and embedding belief systems into governance. They also demonstrated vulnerability, revealing how ecological limits and political instability could unravel complexity. Their story remains a touchstone for thinking about the possibilities and perils of civilization. For the listener today, the details may feel remote. Clay tablets, reed styluses, barley fields, omens carved into animal livers. Yet the underlying themes remain familiar. The need for shared rules, the tension between labor and authority, the quest for meaning in uncertainty, all persist. We live with digital records instead of clay, but the impulse to document, calculate, and preserve is continuous. We seek forecasts in data models rather than star charts, but the desire to anticipate the future is unchanged. As the sun set over Babylon or Ur, smoke rising from temple offerings, families gathered in courtyards, eating bread and stew, perhaps telling stories under the watch of stars. Life was fragile, uncertain, but also structured by ritual and record. They could not know that centuries later their routines would be studied as foundations of civilization. Yet in their ledgers, hymns, and bricks, they left a legacy strong enough to outlast the very rivers that sustained them. The story of Mesopotamia closes not with a dramatic collapse, but with a layered inheritance. Its innovations in writing, law, farming, religion, and governance spread outward, adapted by successors. Its mistakes, too, remained as cautionary traces. What endures is the reminder that even in the most ordinary acts, counting sheep, diverting water, offering bread, civilization is built. And in these small, steady efforts, the Mesopotamians shaped a world that still bears their imprint. When we leave the world of Mesopotamia, with its clay tablets and floodplain cities, and turn our gaze further west, we arrive in another riverine world. The Nile, flowing from the heart of Africa to the Mediterranean, defined life in ancient Egypt. Like Mesopotamia, it offered fertile soil and predictable rhythms, but unlike the twin rivers' erratic floods, the Nile's inundation was steady, almost clockwork. For Egyptians, this rhythm was not simply a fact of nature, it was the framework of existence. To live in Egypt was to live by the river's cycle, to eat from its banks, to measure time in its rise and fall. The year divided into three main seasons: Akhet, the flood; Pere, the growing season; and Shemu, the harvest. Farmers oriented their labor around this cycle. During Akhet, when the Nile overflowed its banks between roughly June and September, fields disappeared under muddy water. Work shifted to canal maintenance, temple projects, and construction, since planting was impossible. When the waters receded, they left behind a rich layer of black silt, renewing fertility. In Pere, from autumn through winter, farmers sowed barley, wheat, flax, and vegetables. Irrigation channels helped guide residual water into fields. By Shemu, in spring and early summer, crops were cut, threshed, and stored in granaries. The rhythm repeated endlessly, offering both security and constraint. Ordinary households depended heavily on this agricultural cycle. Barley was the staple, brewed into beer and baked into bread, the daily fare for peasants and nobles alike. Flat loaves, often coarse with chaff, provided bulk nutrition. Beer, thick and slightly sour, was consumed throughout the day, supplying calories and hydration. Vegetables such as onions, leeks, garlic, and beans supplemented the diet. Dates and figs offered sweetness, while fish from the Nile added protein. Meat was rare fee, or common people, reserved for feasts, though wealthier households consumed more regularly. The tools of farming were simple but effective. Wooden plows, sometimes tipped with copper, were drawn by oxen. Sickles made of wood inset with flint blades cut grain. Shaduffs, counterweighted poles with a bucket on one end, lifted water from canals for irrigation. Farming was labor-intensive, demanding cooperation within families and villages. Seasonal rhythms dictated not only diet, but also social obligations. Corvée labor on state projects during inundation, village rituals to mark planting, feasts at harvest. Work was not confined to fields. The Nile itself was a highway, carrying boats laden with grain, stone, pottery, and papyrus. Ordinary Egyptians learned to navigate reed boats and small wooden vessels, ferrying goods between villages and towns. Markets bustled with trade, though much of the economy operated on barter or state redistribution rather than coinage. A farmer might exchange surplus grain for pottery or linen, or pay taxes in kind, depositing sacks of barley at a granary overseen by scribes. The scribes held a unique position in this society. Trained in hieroglyphs and hieratic script, they recorded everything from tax receipts to temple inventories. For the majority of Egyptians, literacy was unattainable. To write was to wield power. Scribes thus served as intermediaries between the common people and the state apparatus. They worked in offices attached to temples or palaces, inscribing rolls of papyrus that tracked the kingdom's flow of resources. Their profession required years of training, and schools drilled students in copying texts, memorizing proverbs, and practicing accounts. Religion permeated every level of life. Each town had its patron deity, each household its protective spirits. Major gods, Ra, Osiris, Isis, Hathor, Amun, were worshipped in grand temples, but ordinary people also engaged in small rituals at shrines or in domestic spaces. Amulets shaped like scarabs or eyes offered protection. The cycles of nature, especially the Nile's flood, were interpreted as divine gifts, tied to the ruler's cosmic role. Pharaohs were seen as intermediaries between gods and humans, their authority legitimized through ritual as much as power. Architecture reflected both grandeur and practicality. Monumental stone temples and tombs remain today, but most Egyptians lived in modest mud brick houses. These structures, often rectangular with flat roofs, were built from readily available clay. Roofs provided extra living space, sometimes for sleeping on hot nights. Interiors were simple. reed mats for beds, clay jars for storage, grinding stones for flour. Families spent much time outdoors, working, socializing, or cooking in courtyards. The simplicity of daily dwellings contrasted with the imposing scale of royal and religious monuments, yet both grew from the same materials and labor cycles. Women played essential roles in this rhythm. In farming households, they baked bread, brewed beer, wove linen, and tended gardens. Some served as priestesses or managed estates. Legal records suggest women could own property, inherit land, and initiate divorce, giving them more autonomy than in many later societies. Their work, though less glorified than that of warriors or officials, sustained households and anchored community life. Children participated early in family labor, carrying water, herding animals, or helping in fields. Toys made of clay, carved wood, or woven reeds have been found in tombs, suggesting moments of play amid work. Education for most child. Dren was informal, based on imitation of parents' tasks, except for those chosen for scribal training. For them, childhood meant long hours of copying characters on ostraca, pottery shards, until they mastered the art of writing. Festivals punctuated the agricultural year, blending work and worship. The Opet festival in Thebes celebrated the god Amun with processions along the Nile. Local feasts marked sowing or harvest. On these days, ordinary people ate better, danced, and enjoyed communal music. Rituals reinforced the cosmic order, reminding participants that their toil connected with divine cycles. Even in hardship, such occasions offered respite and belonging. The Egyptian sense of time emphasized continuity. The Nile's regularity fostered confidence that each year would bring renewal. Calendars were based on the star Sirius and the flood's arrival, linking celestial patterns to earthly life. Farmers, priests, and officials alike looked to these markers as anchors. Yet within this rhythm, uncertainties persisted. Years of low flood brought famine, while excessive inundation destroyed homes. The reliance on a single river was both strength and vulnerability. The granaries of Egypt provided a safety net. State officials collected grain taxes and stored surplus in large silos. In good years, these stores supported temple workers, builders, and soldiers. In poor years, they fed the population, though distribution could be uneven. Control of surplus reinforced state authority, binding common labor to the machinery of pharaonic rule. Ordinary Egyptians might not have seen the inscriptions glorifying kings, but they felt the effects when rations arrived, or failed to. Death, too, was woven into daily consciousness. Funerary practices extended beyond royal tombs. Even modest households prepared for the afterlife with simple goods, amulets, pottery, or food offerings. The belief in continuity after death, judged by the weighing of the heart against the feather of Ma'at, shaped how people lived. To act justly, to honor gods and kin, was not only moral, but practical, securing a place in the eternal order. Archaeological finds show this blend of ordinary and spiritual life. Ostraca with sketches, fragments of household records, broken tools, all reveal the texture of existence. In villages like Deir el-Medina, home to tomb builders, inscriptions on walls record gossip, disputes, and payments. Workers noted absences from duty due to illness, funerals, or temple feasts. These details remind us that even those who built monuments to eternity lived in the immediacy of daily concerns. The enduring fascination with Egypt often emphasizes grandeur, pyramids, mummies, golden treasures. Yet the truest legacy lies in the millions of unseen lives, bound to the river's rhythm, whose labor made the monuments possible. Their world was one of bread and beer, of mud brick and silt, of rituals performed by torchlight in village shrines. To understand Egypt is to recognize that greatness rested on the ordinary, repeated endlessly, sustained by the Nile. And yet even within this apparent stability, questions arise. How did these cycles persist for thousands of years with so little fundamental change? What allowed Egyptian society to balance continuity with adaptation, to maintain both resilience and rigidity? The answers lie partly in the river, partly in belief, and partly in the unrecorded decisions of countless farmers, bakers, and scribes. But to trace these threads more closely, we must look deeper into the structures of state and temple, where the lives of the many intersected with the ambitions of the few. The Egyptian state rested on two interwoven pillars, the pharaoh's authority and the temple's economic might. To the outside eye, Egypt may appear as a land of pyramids and kings, but beneath these symbols stretched a complex web of administration, labor, and ritual that touched every village. Understanding this structure means stepping into the quiet mechanisms of governance, where scribes, officials, and priests kept the machinery of society turning. The pharaoh stood at the center, both ruler and divine mediator. Yet no king could personally manage the vast territories stretching from the delta marshes to Nubia. Administration required layers of officials. At the top stood the vizier, chief minister, responsible for justice, taxation, and infrastructure. Beneath him operated regional governors called nomarchs, who oversaw Egypt's districts, or nomes. Each nome had its local centers, granaries, and temples, which collected produce and labor from surrounding villages. The state's power was measured in grain. Taxes were assessed in kind, not in coin. After harvest, scribes tallied yields, often in granaries attached to temples or royal estates. They measured grain using standardized containers, recording amounts on ostraca or papyrus rolls. These records traveled upward through the bureaucracy, forming the backbone of state planning. Granaries thus served as both storage facilities and symbols of control. For ordinary farmers, delivering a share of barley or wheat was not optional. It was the price of stability, enforced by the presence of local officials. Temples formed parallel centers of power. Far more than places of worship, they were economic engines. Large temples owned fields, herds, and workshops. They employed scribes, artisans, and laborers, redistributing food and goods. Priests managed daily offerings to gods, ensuring that statues were clothed, fed, osauced, and honored. These rituals required constant supplies: bread, beer, meat, linen, sourced from temple estates. In turn, temples provided employment and relief in times of scarcity. For villagers, temples were not distant institutions but part of daily exchange, places where one delivered produce, sought blessings, or worked seasonally. This intertwining of state and temple meant that religion and administration were inseparable. To pay taxes was to sustain gods as well as rulers. To participate in festivals was to affirm political order. For Egyptians, the boundaries between the sacred and the practical blurred. The pharaoh's decrees were not simply commands. They were framed as maintaining ma'at, the cosmic balance. Every official act, from collecting grain to digging canals, carried religious significance. The bureaucracy's efficiency depended on scribes. These men filled offices in villages, nomes, and temples. They recorded harvests, tracked laborers, registered land boundaries, and compiled legal disputes. Their ink and reed pens preserved the hum of administration. Training a scribe was a long process, involving memorization of signs, proverbs, and model letters. School texts often emphasized the superiority of writing over manual labor, promising comfort and prestige to those who mastered the craft. Yet the reality was often less glamorous: endless copying, routine calculations, and oversight of reluctant taxpayers. Still, the written word ensured continuity across centuries, allowing Egypt to govern itself with remarkable stability. Labor was another cornerstone of the system. During the flood season, when fields lay underwater, farmers were conscripted for state projects. This corvée labor built canals, maintained dikes, and transported stone. Workers received rations of bread, beer, and onions rather than wages. Major constructions, such as temples or tombs, required thousands of hands. Contrary to popular imagination, these were not enslaved masses, but rotating crews of conscripted villagers, supplemented by skilled artisans. Records from Deir el-Medina show that workers received regular supplies, could petition officials, and even went on strike when rations failed. The logistics of construction reveal the state's organizational capacity. To build a temple or pyramid, officials coordinated stone quarrying, transport along the Nile, storage of timber, and feeding of laborers. Quarry marks and workers' graffiti testify to the human scale of these efforts. Teams with nicknames carved their presence into stone blocks, leaving traces of humor and pride amid toil. For the common laborer, such projects meant months away from fields, but also steady food and perhaps a sense of participation in something enduring. Justice, too, was part of the bureaucratic order. Local disputes over land, debt, or theft were heard by councils of elders or officials, with scribes recording testimony. At higher levels, cases might reach the vizier. Punishments varied: fines, forced labor, or corporal penalties. The legal system, like taxation, was framed as upholding ma'at. Even mundane cases carried cosmic weight. To lie under oath was not merely to deceive officials, but to endanger one's soul in the afterlife. Communication within this system relied on messengers traveling the Nile and desert roads. Papyrus letters, sealed with clay impressions, carried instructions between officials. The Nile's navigability allowed messages and goods to flow relatively quickly. This network tied distant villages to the central state, ensuring that orders from Memphis or Thebes reached farmers in far-off nomes. For ordinary people, the state was not an abstract entity. It was the arrival of a scribe demanding grain, the assignment of canal work, the presence of priests at festivals. Yet beneath this order lay tensions. Heavy taxation could strain households, particularly in years of poor floods. Corvée labor removed farmers from their fields, threatening local subsistence. Temples accumulated wealth, sometimes rivaling royal authority. Dynastic changes and periods of weakness often exposed these fault lines. Ordinary Egyptians, however, adapted quietly, reducing consumption, relying on extended families, or turning to local shrines for support. Survival depended not only on state redistribution, but on village solidarity. At the household level, administration intruded in subtle ways. Grain deliveries required precise measurement. Scribes checked sacks for underfilling. Cattle counts ensured taxes on livestock. Land surveys marked out plots, sometimes shifting boundaries after floods. For villagers, these events were part of the annual rhythm, blending with sowing and harvest. Participation was unavoidable, yet it reinforced a sense of belonging to a larger whole. The grandeur of Egyptian monuments tempts us to see only kings and gods, but the bureaucracy behind them reveals a more complex story. Without scribes tallying barley, without officials assigning labor, without priests ensuring daily offerings, the temples would have stood empty, the state powerless. Ordinary people, bound by obligation yet sustained by redistribution, formed the foundation. Their compliance, punctuated by small acts of resistance, allowed the system to endure for millennia. Still, questions linger. How did ordinary Egyptians perceive this apparatus? Did they see it as oppressive, or simply as the natural order? Were complaints voiced in whispered conversations at grinding stones, or in graffiti hidden from official eyes? The records show the state's perspective, but the voices of farmers and bakers remain faint. To glimpse them, we must turn to indirect traces. The notes of absentee workers, the petitions of villagers, the quiet humor of graffiti. In these fragments lies a more human picture, one that complicates the smooth image of pharaonic power. The quiet hum of Egyptian civilization was not carried only by kings, priests, and scribes, but by the countless artisans and workers who filled villages with steady rhythms of craft. These were the potters, weavers, carpenters, and stonecutters, whose skills translated raw materials into the objects of everyday life. Their efforts reveal another dimension of Egypt's durability, a culture of practical expertise, handed down through families, rooted in local workshops and households. Pottery was indispensable. Every home relied on jars, bowls, and amphorae for storage, cooking, and transport. Potters worked in village kilns, shaping Nile clay on simple wheels or by hand. They tempered the clay with sand or straw, adjusted firing times, and produced vessels of varying quality. The humblest coarse jars held beer or water. Finer wares served at temples or elite households. Decoration was minimal. Egyptian pottery valued function over display. For ordinary people, pots were consumables, replaced often, their breakage an accepted fact of life. Yet without them, grain could not be stored, water could not be carried, meals could not be cooked. Textiles provided another steady occupation. Weaving was primarily women's work, performed in households or small workshops. Looms stood in courtyards or shaded rooms where flax fibers were spun into thread and woven into linen. Linen was Egypt's dominant fabric, used for clothing, bedding, and even mummy wrappings. Its quality ranged from coarse cloth for laborers to gossamer-thin garments prized by elites. Dyeing was limited. Most clothing remained the pale color of natural linen. Garments were simple. Kilts for men, sheath dresses for women, sometimes supplemented with shawls or jewelry. The elegance lay not in variety, but in the purity of white cloth, kept clean by frequent washing in Nile water mixed with natron. Carpenters and jay, oiners turned acacia, sycamore, or imported cedar into furniture, doors, and tools. Their craft required precision, for Egypt's climate was harsh on wood. Mortise and tenon joints, pegs, and lashings held pieces together. Even modest households owned stools or low tables, while wealthier homes displayed beds, chests, and chairs with carved legs. Tools themselves, adzes, chisels, saws, were products of metal workers who smelted copper and later bronze in small furnaces. Blacksmiths also produced knives, sickles, and fishing hooks, supplying farmers and fishermen alike. Each trade supported another, forming a web of interdependence. Stonecutters represented a more specialized group. From quarries, they extracted blocks for temples or tombs using dolerite pounders and copper chisels. At construction sites, masons dressed the stone, aligning it with remarkable precision. Smaller stone objects, alabaster vessels, granite statues, were produced in workshops, requiring endless polishing with sand. These objects often bore inscriptions, linking artisans to the scribe's world. To carve hieroglyphs into stone was both technical and sacred, demanding accuracy that would endure for eternity. Metalwork remained relatively limited, as Egypt lacked abundant local ores. Copper came from Sinai, gold from Nubia, silver and tin through trade. This scarcity made metal precious, reserved for tools, ornaments, and ritual objects. Most households relied on stone, wood, or faience for everyday needs. The presence of bronze tools marked status, not routine. For the farmer, a wooden plough tipped with copper was the height of practicality, enough to scratch Nile soil for sowing grain. Food preparation reveals another layer of daily labor. Women ground grain on stone querns, a task consuming hours each day. The result was coarse flour, baked into flat loaves in clay ovens. Beer, brewed from barley bread and flavored with herbs, was the staple drink, nourishing and relatively safe. Meals for ordinary households consisted of bread, beer, onions, and occasional fish. Meat was rare, appearing more often in festival distributions, or as dried strips preserved for later. Seasonal produce, dates, figs, melons, supplemented the diet. Honey, though prized, was scarce. Most sweetness came from dates or carob. Cooking methods were simple. Stews simmered in clay pots, bread baked against hot stones, fish roasted over coals. Utensils were minimal, often wooden spoons or reed baskets. Meals were communal, eaten while seated on mats, with food shared from common bowls. Tableware might be plain pottery, its roughness softened by use. Even in elite homes, the basic diet mirrored that of commoners, though with more variety and refinement. What distinguished classes was not the type of food, but its frequency and abundance. Household organization reflected labor division. Women managed food, weaving, and child-rearing. Men farmed, fished, or pursued trades. Children contributed early, boys herding goats, girls assisting at looms. Grandparents, when present, played roles in childcare or light tasks. Domestic animals, cats, dogs, donkeys, lived in close proximity, blurring lines between human and animal space. Chickens were absent, they arrived later, but geese and ducks provided eggs and occasional meat. Religion infused even these mundane routines. Household shrines, often niches with small figurines, honored protective deities. Offerings of bread or incense connected daily life to the divine. Amulets shaped like ankhs, scarabs, or household gods protected against illness or misfortune. The line between work and worship blurred. Grinding grain might be accompanied by prayers for health, weaving by invocations of fertility. Festivals punctuated the calendar, bringing moments of collective relief from daily toil. Artisanship was often hereditary, skills passed from parent to child, ensuring continuity of craft traditions. Villages specialized, some known for pottery, others for weaving or metalwork. Deir el-Medina, the community of tomb builders near Thebes, illustrates this. Its residents were highly skilled artisans who decorated royal tombs. Their records survive in abundance, offering rare glimpses of daily disputes, ration lists, and even satirical sketches. They remind us that artisans had personalities, humor, and frustrations, not merely roles. The rhythm of craftwork was seasonal. During flood months, with fields submerged, farmers might turn to part-time crafts. After harvest, demand for pottery and storage jars rose. Major state projects required carpenters and masons in cycles tied to available labor. Thus, even specialized work remained connected to the agricultural year. The Nile's rhythm shaped not only crops, but crafts, drawing villagers into a broader seasonal economy. Markets displayed this diversity. Stalls sold pottery, cloth, fish, vegetables, and trinkets. Prices were not fixed in coin, but negotiated through barter or measures of grain and copper. For artisans, markets were both opportunities and uncertainties. Sales varied with festivals, harvest yields, and household needs. Still, they provided outlets beyond state or temple distribution, sustaining local economies. What emerges is a picture of Egypt not as static or monolithic, but as a network of workshops and households, each contributing small but vital pieces. The temples and palaces might command, but the hands that shaped pots, wove linen, or carved stone sustained the system. For the majority, survival meant steady, repetitive labor, bound to cycles of sun and river. Their creativity lay not in invention, but in continuity, producing the same forms generation after generation, ensuring stability across centuries. And yet, questions linger. How did artisans perceive their role in this vast order? Did they take pride in pots that vanished into kitchens, or in blocks that vanished into pyramids? Did they resent the endless repetition, or did rhythm itself offer comfort? The monuments tell us of kings and gods, but the traces of calloused hands remain harder to read. Perhaps in the faint lines of graffiti, in the playful sketches left by bored workers, we glimpse a more personal voice, a reminder that even in the world's most enduring civilization, ordinary people sought meaning amid routine. Egypt's greatness was never only in its pharaohs or monuments, it was in the small, repeated acts of millions of ordinary people, sowing, reaping, grinding, weaving, hauling, praying, that sustained the civilization across centuries. To appreciate the endurance of ancient Egypt, one must look not just at pyramids and temples, but at the infrastructure of life that made them possible. This final reflection ties together the threads of Nile cycles, social organization, craft, and faith, showing how the Egyptians transformed continuity into legacy. The Nile remained the anchor. Its annual flood was predictable enough to sustain planning, yet varied enough to command vigilance. Each year, Anticipation rose as waters swelled in Upper Egypt, carrying silt from Ethiopian highlands. The black soil deposited on fields allowed wheat and barley to flourish, supporting dense populations. But the Nile was more than farmland. It was Egypt's highway, moving people, grain and stone. Boats with square sails and oars plied its currents, linking distant nomes. The river stitched Egypt together, north to south, functioning as lifeline and unifier. Without it, no centralized state could have persisted. The state harnessed this natural rhythm with careful bureaucracy. Scribes tallied harvests, tracked laborers, and recorded taxes in hieroglyphs and hieratic. Their papyrus scrolls, though fragile, represented enduring systems of control. Officials dispatched rations to workers, managed temple estates, and mediated disputes. Temples themselves served as economic hubs, owning land, livestock, and workshops. Priests oversaw both rituals and resource flows. Kingship rested on this machinery. The pharaoh's divine aura required the material support of grain silos, quarries, and craft shops. What distinguished Egypt from many civilizations was its stability. Dynasties rose and fell, yet the dynasties, lying patterns of agriculture, religion, and administration persisted. Farmers continued to sow after the flood. Artisans continued to shape stone. Priests continued to perform rites. This continuity reflected both geography and worldview. The desert hemmed Egypt in, shielding it from frequent invasions. The Nile's rhythm encouraged a cyclical view of time, where renewal followed decline. Egyptians imagined eternity not as endless change, but as unbroken return, a stability mirrored in their political culture. Religion reinforced this sense of order. Gods embodied natural forces: Hapi the flood, Ra the sun, Osiris the cycle of life and death. Pharaohs claimed divine roles, mediating between gods and people. Temples orchestrated festivals that punctuated agricultural cycles, binding community to cosmos. Funerary practices emphasized preparation for eternity, encouraging investment in tombs, amulets, and rituals. For elites, this meant monumental tombs. For commoners, modest burials with simple goods. Yet the logic was shared. Death was a passage requiring provisions, and the living ensured continuity by honoring the dead. This worldview permeated work. Farmers offered first fruits, craftsmen inscribed prayers, families maintained household shrines. Daily labor was framed as participation in cosmic order, ma'at, the principle of balance and justice. Maintaining ma'at meant fulfilling one's role, tilling fields, delivering taxes, performing rituals. Disruption threatened not only material survival but spiritual harmony. Thus, obedience to authority was not merely pragmatic but metaphysical, reinforcing stability. At the same time, ordinary life had its tensions. Tomb inscriptions and records from Deir el-Medina reveal worker strikes, disputes over rations, and petitions to officials. These remind us that Egyptians were not passive. They negotiated, complained, and sometimes resisted. Yet their grievances were framed within the system, appealing to Maat and Pharaoh's justice. Even unrest reinforced the expectation of restored order. Artisanship played its part in legacy. Pottery fragments, linen scraps, carved stelae. These humble artifacts survive in abundance, more so than elite treasures. They show continuity of form. Bread molds of the Old Kingdom resemble those of later dynasties. Linen weaving techniques persisted across centuries. This conservatism was intentional. To repeat ancestral patterns was to honor tradition and ensure stability. Innovation occurred. Introduction of bronze, new artistic styles, but always within bounds of recognizable continuity. The Egyptian household formed the microcosm of this civilization. Courtyards filled with grinding stones, weaving looms, and cooking fires sustained families. Meals of bread and beer nourished workers who built temples. Children played with clay dolls or reed boats, echoing adult activities. Cats prowled for mice, dogs guarded doorways, geese honked in pens. Such scenes, repeated endlessly, formed the true substance of Egypt's longevity. Kings came and went, but bread was baked, linen woven, and fields sown again and again. When we look at monuments, the pyramids of Giza, the temples of Karnak, the tombs of the Valley of the Kings, we must remember the labor behind them. Each stone was quarried, hauled, and set by workers who lived in villages, ate rations, and slept on reed mats. Their names are mostly forgotten, though some carved graffiti remind us of their presence. Without their steady labor, the grand symbols of pharaonic power would not exist. Thus, the story of Egypt is as much theirs as it is the pharaohs. Egypt's endurance eventually waned. Foreign invasions, shifting trade routes, and internal divisions eroded pharaonic power. Persians, Greeks, and Romans absorbed the Nile Valley. Yet even under foreign rule, Egyptian traditions persisted. Temples continued, local priests maintained rituals, villagers sowed and harvested as before. The weight of continuity was so strong that conquerors adapted to it, adopting Egyptian imagery and titles. Cleopatra herself, though Macedonian Greek, presented herself as pharaoh, embodying Egyptian expectations. In reflecting on Egypt's legacy, one sees not only monuments but lessons in sustainability. The Nile's gifts were finite, requiring careful management. Egyptians balanced irrigation, stored surpluses, and adjusted to seasonal rhythms. Their worldview of cyclical renewal fostered resilience. While dynasties shifted, the fundamentals endured for 3 millennia. Few civilizations have matched this duration. The secret lay not in grand innovations, but in faithful repetition of routines that worked. Today, archaeologists uncover potsherds, tools, and household remains that testify to this continuity. A broken grinding stone reveals more about daily life than a gilded sarcophagus. A child's toy boat carved from wood tells of play that transcends centuries. These fragments remind us that Egypt was not only about kings and gods, but about families, labor, and persistence. For the listener, perhaps there is comfort in this. Civilizations rise and fall, but what sustains them are ordinary acts: planting, cooking, weaving, caring. Egypt's longevity was built on stability, not spectacle. In that sense, the hum of grinding grain or the splash of oars on the Nile mattered as much as royal decrees. The legacy of Egypt lies not only in monuments of stone, but in rhythms of life that endured, quiet and steady, across generations. And so we close this journey through ancient Egypt. We leave the riverbanks where farmers tilled fields, the workshops where artisans shaped clay, the temples where priests chanted, and the households where families shared bread. What remains is the sense of continuity, a civilization sustained not by constant change, but by patient repetition. In a world where much feels uncertain, the Egyptians remind us that stability itself can be a form of greatness, and that sometimes the most enduring legacies are found in the quiet routines of ordinary life.